Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Random. Egberto Willis, your host. Today we have a very special guest. Seth David Radwell is the author of American Schism and an international known business executive and thought leader in consumer marketing. He previously served as president of eScholastic, the digital arm of the global children's publishing and education company, and as president of Bookspan Bertelsmann, where he developed book clubs for diverse readership, Black Expressions, and Mosaico, in addition to overseeing all editorial, marketing, media, and digital functions for many other iconic brands. He holds a master's degree in public policy for the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and Bachelor of Arts degree summa cum laude from Columbia University. He currently divides his time between New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. How you doing today, Senor Seth?
I am thrilled to be with you here, and I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, look, look, just the title of the book, man, American Schism. Come on, you have to like it. But anyhow, you talk about there being two Americas. What are we talking about? Because we know that, but a lot of Americans, a lot of people want to kind of say that that's not a reality. Explain.
Well, so of course, there is a tremendous American divide today, as we all know. But I feel that the current dialogue and the current approach to understanding it is actually misinformed because we're caught in two bubbles. I mean, the one we hear about all the time, Egberto, is our partisan bubble, that we're getting news from one source, and there's no more kind of Walter Cronkite news that's objective. But there's another bubble. The other bubble is a time bubble. We think that we're so unique, but the truth is that the political divisions in this country are not new. They've existed for our entire history. So my mission on this research project was to do an investigative tracing, to take our divide and understand it back from the founding of the country and how it's evolved over the centuries. And that's exactly what I did in American Schism. I go back to the founding where there was a major disagreement, a kind of a break in views between two Enlightenment schools, what I call the moderate Enlightenment and the radical Enlightenment. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The point being is that the antecedents for what we see today, the rancor and the acrimony, go back to our founding. And unless we understand their chronological history and their evolution, we're not going to be able to make progress at getting to solutions.
And I'm so glad to hear somebody say that. Our problems are all that makes up what makes America began at the beginning. Oh, great. We just realized that all this began at the beginning. Now, you said something interesting. You said the Declaration of Independence was radical, but yes, the Constitution was moderate. Now, here's the deal. I agree with that. I wonder if I agree with it for the same reason you do. So explain.
Okay. Well, one of the things the book does, after laying out this radical moderate split, it then analyzes our history through 6 discrete periods using that as a lens. So you bring up a great one, which is the first major one. The radical nature of the Declaration states that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. That is a radical statement that comes from Thomas Jefferson's pen, which is ironic in its own sense, which we can get into later, but which comes out of the French Enlightenment and the notion of the notion of a republic, the social contract requiring an egalitarian form of government of the people to be just. So there are two main differences with the radicals and the moderates, to make it easy. One is that the radicals believed in an egalitarian representative democracy as the sole legitimate form of government. And the second thing is that the radicals believed there needed to be a strong separation between church and state. They documented how the church for centuries had colluded with the monarchy to keep the people oppressed. Whereas the moderates, people like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, were very much aristocratic Republicans. So that's the crux of the difference. So to answer your question, the Declaration is quite radical. So what happened between 1776 and 1787? And that's an entire chapter of American Schism. why was it that all of a sudden that things became so moderate and we had to compromise to keep the southern colonies involved and do crazy things like what would seem absurd today, like calling African Americans 3/5 of a person? How did we make those compromises? And the answer to that question is that declaring independence from Britain and stating bold ideals is one thing. Building a country with real solutions and a complex system of government that had the ability to raise taxes, pay for the war, develop a foreign policy, all of that complexity, as we say, the devil is in the details. That complexity required an incredible amount of what's today a dirty word, compromise. And so James Madison and many others literally compromised between what became the Federalists and the Republicans on these two alternate models. And we ended up with a compromise that of course was, as Lincoln has told us almost 100 years later, didn't do justice to the creed of the Declaration. Remember, he said our work is not done, but it was a first attempt, and it was certainly better than the Articles of Confederation. So in summary, to answer your question, I think there was a need for practical solutions that required compromise. And so people that were problem solvers, geniuses like Alexander Hamilton, who could run the country, they put solutions in place that would actually work.
Now, when does compromise become capitulation?
That is one of the most incredible questions. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because clearly, if you look at our history, we have examples when compromise has really worked. And I could talk about one that's really very, very important right now. But in the case of African Americans and Native Americans, I would say compromises have really fell short. Those are some of the areas where, what American Schism does after going through this history, it boils down the key questions that are really foundational from all the stuff you hear today to three things. And one of them is, do we truly believe in a government bottom up of the people? And if the answer to that question is yes, and by the way, I think there are many people in the Republican
What do you
Party
think the answer? Wait, what do you think the answer is?
I think it's the only form of government that's epistemologically superior. What do I mean by that? It's a form of government where we can learn. In other words, in an autocracy, which of course the world is moving towards, decisions are handed down from above, and people have to live with it. But the radical enlighteners, especially the French radical enlighteners, understood that the true meaning of the Enlightenment was the capacity of the individual and the education of the individual. Democracy is the only form of government that allows humans to use their God-given capacities of empirical observation and reason to come to solutions. So it is a superior form.
I want to stop you in a second here, because and this may be part of your book, maybe not a part of your book, because I think, first of all, I think this discussion is actually great. We talk about the problems beginning from the inception of the country, from the founding of the country, radicalism versus moderate, etc. And I asked you the question as far as when does compromise become capitulation? Because as you rightly pointed out, that as far as natives are concerned, as far as blacks are concerned, as far as Chinese is concerned, everybody could make a compromise on the lives of those. That's where compromise were made. The question I think it's essential for us to ask is, isn't it then maybe the hypocrisy of the initial that allows us to be where we're at today? True or false?
That's a tough one. I would say false in the following sense. There's always hypocrisy, so I'm not denying that. But what I'm trying to do in the American Schism, Humberto, is take a longer term perspective, a longitudinal. So let me throw out a couple of stats. And 200 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was 31 years. Now it's over 70. 200 years ago, 1 in 5 children died before the age of 5. Today, almost all survive. 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, 1/5 of the world does. So over the past 200 years, thanks to our endowment of the Enlightenment, of science and reason, we have made more progress in human prosperity than in the prior 2000. So over the long haul, we've made tremendous progress. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is great, and there are parts of society that have really not been treated, that have been oppressed for a long time. But I think the point is we can't give up on our, there's this notion today, Egberto, which drives me crazy, of everyone having their own truth. Like as
There's
if
not, yeah, right.
yeah, there's such a thing as objective truth. And unless we embrace it, and the US, the country has been built on disagreements. We can disagree as long as we're having a rational argument based on facts and truth. And that's what made me write this book and leave my business career put it on hiatus, if you will, was I could not tolerate, it was bad enough to tolerate how our political discourse had collapsed, but I couldn't tolerate the assault on truth, how objective truth has disappeared. And so I'm trying to bring this back to your question, because I think there's been hypocrisy, there's been compromises, but over the long haul, we have made progress. And what drives me crazy about the right, or the far right for sure, and other elements of the established right, is this notion of spreading what are basically lies, of not believing in facts. Okay, and that, one of the great examples is we've counted the vote in Arizona 19 times. Do we have to count it again? That's what I call. I reject that approach because it's denying the facts. And I have debates with people all the time on both sides of the aisle, and I'm happy to discuss issues. But as soon as they start, I always say we can agree on interpretation. We have to agree on the facts. We can disagree on the interpretation of the data. That's fine. But there's a big difference between that. And so the American Schism is trying to show how today the dialogue in America is held hostage to this identity politics where so many people feel imprisoned by their own self-imposed mobs. They're afraid to say anything. And the left bears some responsibility for that too, which I point out in the book. But so there have been hypocrisies, but we've made enormous progress. And I can give you one of the things American Schism does is go through examples like the Progressive Party and the Progressive Era of the 19th century, or certainly the Civil Rights Movement. But there have been many times. What the book really ends up showing is that there's this pendulum swing. We tend to make progress, like radical reconstruction. We had an incredible opportunity as you know, I'm sure you know.
Yeah, 1865, yeah.
But in the next couple of elections, Egberto, 85% of Southern African Americans were registered and were voting.
Right.
And then fast forward 15 years, but thanks to the Ku Klux Klan and everything else, 5% were. So we had this pendulum swing where we seem to make progress and move towards a more egalitarian, embracing notion that fulfills the creed and the Declaration. And then almost like every force has an equal and opposite reaction, we have like a pushback. And I argue, go ahead.
In engineering, what we have this stuff known as a steady state error, and that's where you keep getting those swings. In other words, it never coalesces to the mean. It just keeps swinging around the mean. So that is sort of a thing that occurs in science as well. So it never coalesces to where it should, but it keeps going back and forth. Anyhow, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about economy. You says, how has the economy shaped the ideas and beliefs of the American on both sides of the divide? Because I want to tackle that a little bit with regards to your book.
Well, so it's the social and political analysis, if you will, of these two different sides and how they fought with each other and contended cannot be looked at without understanding the economics behind it. They're fundamental. From the form of, Jefferson's original notion of an agrarian economy that was this idyllic vision that he had, to what happened. For example, I mentioned the Progressive Era. The amazing coalition of the Farmers Alliance, which were Southerners that were incredibly mistreated by the economic system of the U.S. Related to the dollar, the greenback policy, and various things. But they ended up making a coalition in some ways with Northerners who were oppressed workers, immigrants. Most of that entire movement, which led to huge change, was economic. It came out of economic need. So my point being is that for every one of the vignettes that I go through in American Schism, you have to portray the economic issues at hand. If you fast forward till today, I would argue that I mentioned before that the French radicals talked about this collusion between the monarchy and the church. We've had a collusion in this country since Billy Graham between the Conservative Party and evangelicalism.
Yeah.
It's a similar collusion where, for economic reasons, conservatives hold their nose and get on board for their own self-interest. And at this point, we're for all intents and purposes, we're a plutocracy run by the rich, right? So they get on board with evangelicals because, ask yourself this question, Egberto. How did Donald Trump get all those 81 million people to vote against their self-interest by supporting the tax plan, which of course benefited his tax plan? He actually said it at the signing. He said to his colleagues, his business colleagues who were there, this is going to make you guys quite rich. And people vote for him. My point being is that there's been a collusion going on between elements of the evangelical church in America and the conservative business movement for quite a while. And I have nothing against faith or religion, but what I do think is not viable with a democracy is when religion or a certain religion takes hostage certain political actors for their own benefits. And that's what's described in the third part of the book in great detail.
I mean, and that is understandable. Look, let me tell you how I talk about it a whole lot. I talk about it being an illness, right? Because I mean, you just said it perfectly. How do you vote against your own interests? Because you don't know, you don't naturally do these things. I mean, a lot of people like to use a lot of the isms, right? The racism, the sexisms, and all of that. That is true. But you know what I've seen? I tell you what, and I don't know how you feel about this. So getting away a little bit from the book here. When Obama got elected, I said to a lot of folks in my show, it proved my point that there is a limit. There is a limit where the isms don't matter. I gave folks an example of when Obama's people were campaigning in Pennsylvania. A guy went up to a house and said, "Hey, we are here to canvass. Who are you voting for?" And the wife turns around to the guy. I don't know why she thought she had to do that, but she turned around to the guy and said, "Honey, who are we voting for?" And he turns around and he says, "We are voting for the N guy." You get my point. And the point being, at that point, his economic necessities, went above his racism.
Right.
That he did
right.
that. And I've always said that in America, we're not, we will reach the point eventually where the right will not be successful in doing this, because eventually people's personal economy will supersede all their isms.
Well, I hope so. But if you look at the example in the rest of the world in terms of autocracy on the march, I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't want to get, again, too far off the scope, but what's going on in China is amazing. And in the sense that because the economic benefits overall are so great and everybody's rising,
right, they're
allowing more and more autocracy. I mean, it's becoming a more oppressive system in many ways, but economically it's not. See, it's a tricky thing. I am personally very concerned, and I know you were, because I've read some of your stuff, about this assault on the. I think we have to reestablish what I say: fight unreason with reason. We have to reclaim our discourse. There is an assault on truth going on in this country now that is so powerful. That is what, of course, the Russians embraced a while ago in terms of disinformation, but it's now been embraced by certain parts of the Republican Party.
But
and
Seth, let me stop you. That's the importance of your book. Because remember what I just said, right? What I just said is, I think in the long run, people are going to be like that guy with Obama. But what's going to give them the impetus to do that are people like yourself, your book, having the baseline. I always talk to people about planting seeds, not wanting them to change today, right, but planting seeds so that when the time comes, they will have that building block on which to change.
So I love that you said that, Egberto, because here's why. Most of my career has been in business. I do have a master's degree in policy, but I built many companies, and I took a hiatus because I couldn't. Most of my personal and business network, whether it was left or right, they didn't want to talk about politics anymore. They felt it was a third rail, and they do what I call put their head in the sand. And I don't think you change people overnight, or even maybe over a while. No. But I think you cannot avoid discussing in a rational way and respectful way issues, especially with the young, because young people cannot take democracy for granted. So I wrote this book to start this movement bottom up of fighting unreason with reason. I think we have to reclaim our democracy, because without objective truth and rational debate, a democracy is doomed.
I agree with you 100%. Now we're at time 20 right now, but I have some more questions I want to ask you. So we're going to go a little bit over.
Okay.
As far as why do you think? Let me put it this way. I was surprised that Donald Trump got 75 million votes. In other words, if we had kept Hillary Clinton's level of, if we didn't go on over, when I say we, I'm talking about progressives and Democrats, had overperformed at 81 million, that 75 million that Trump got was even more than what Hillary Clinton got, beating him by 3 million.
That's right.
How do you explain that?
So there's a chapter in the book that, remember I told you about this pendulum back and forth?
Right.
In some ways, it looks at the Trump era as a pendulum pushed back from the Obama era. But Trump was a master demagogue. And if you look across history, what demagogues do is they figure out how to push buttons that incite rage and fear. I mean, this is not, this has been going on with demagogues for history. Trump was a master at that. Now, he didn't create the rage. That had been building for years. And the book talks about that as well. But he was a master of unleashing it, unleashing the rage. And that's why he develops a cult-like following. So the answer to your question is, he's created a whole movement that denies truth. Let me give you an example. I was sitting downstairs with one of my neighbors who I hadn't seen in a while because I was away. And I was talking to him and I said, I just got the vaccine. That's why I'm traveling again. I'm really comfortable. And I said to him, what about you? Did you get vaccinated? And he said to me, are you kidding me? I'm not going to get that vaccine. Right. Now, I'm not saying that there are some good reasons maybe people don't want to get vaccinated, but with one sentence, he showed me that he was part of this cult of denying that we have a virus that is claimed how many American lives? 600,000?
606,000.
Okay. So like, that's what I mean about living in reality. What I call, in the book, I call it this lay postmodernism. The foundation of the Enlightenment was all about objective truth. And then that was the prevalent model of the world until 50 years ago, when the Reconstructionists, the postmodern movement said everything is relative. And now that's translated into everyone can have their own truth. No, that's not true. What the postmodern movement really wanted to do was bring other perspectives into the conversation, because so much of our history was written by white men. So the intent was to bring other viewpoints in, which is fundamental, but that doesn't mean that objective truth doesn't exist. So we've gone way too far. I believe that fixing this is going to take time, but it has to do with things like civic education, which is required for
that is where I was going to next. I was going to say we need to close out with you giving us an example of, because there's a whole lot to the book. What we want to do is we want people to go out there and get the book, but give us a little bit of things that you think that people would love to hear. Say, hey, there is a solution to all of this.
Okay, great. So let me give you a couple examples. There's two solutions I'll give you that are in the book in the third part. One is structural, and one is more of an investment. The structural one is easy. The way our system works, we are captive by two parties that run the show, and they're a monopoly. And we can't have other candidates in, because every time they're a spoiler, they take votes from one. There's a thing called ranked choice voting, where there could be 6 or 7 platforms out there, and voters are allowed to rank them in order of preference. So as soon as some of the lower ones drop out, their votes get reallocated. And all of a sudden, third parties are not spoilers. Mm-hmm. This is a structural thing that has been shown to it's more democratic. in many ways. So that's a structural thing that I go into in some detail in the book. Let me give you one which less structural and more about priorities. You know, we as a society in America spend an amazing amount of time and wealth managing our money and our investment in financial assets. We don't nearly invest as much time and attention to our human capital. If we need to make a significant if we don't realize that what's going on in the world with China and Asia, if we don't re-embrace investment not only in STEM, science, technology, math, but also civic education about what it means to be in a democracy, as Daniel Allen from Harvard has pointed out, we are not going to be able to compete. So what I'm saying is that's about a priority. We have to shift our gears and realize that not only has education become wildly unequal in access, the actual topics that we teach our children have moved away from debate, analysis of opinions, the ability to objectively receive information and weigh evidence. That's what you need for a democracy.
You know, I think you're summing it all up when you say what we probably need to start doing again is teaching critical thinking, how people can actually learn about critical thinking. Now, Seth, last question that I always ask is, what would you have liked me to, first of all, in 10 seconds, tell people why they should get your book, and then in 30 seconds, please go ahead and tell me what I should have asked you that I didn't in 20 seconds.
So people should get the book because I think the unique part of the book is this historical tracing that shows that even though we seem like we're so divided today, the divisions are not new. There's a real history that unless we understand and embrace, we're going to have trouble making a difference today, which is breaking out of our time bubble. The question that I wish you would have asked me is, well, or I wanted to discuss more is, why is it that through social media or through other forms of communication, our dialogue has become so rancorous, whereas, you know, that my data show that 70% of Americans reject both the extreme left and right and believe we have more in common. Why doesn't that come out? And the answer is, we are now, you know, the human species over millennia of evolution have these amygdala-driven knee-jerk reactions based on fear and anger, and those things are important. They get endorphins going. If you know, Egberto, we all know this because if you're in a sports arena, we know how good it feels to be with the in-group and attack the out-group. It feels wonderful. That's a wonderful thing for a football game. It's no way to conduct public policy. And so that when I say our entire approach to this Twitter storm is wrong and it's misguided, and we have to say enough is enough. And I'm calling on my professional colleagues with Fight on Reason, with Reason, to embrace American Schism as a platform of rejecting the dialogue today and starting it fresh.
Seth David Radwell, author of American Schism. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Egberto, it's been such a pleasure, and I'd be happy to come back with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.